Pleasure to welcome you at the Diplomatic Academy. My name is, for those who don't know me, Emil Brix. I'm the director of this oldest diplomatic institute on the globe. And it's a pleasure to discuss Indo-Pacific issues again this evening. I'm saying again because we had last May here the Assistant Foreign Minister Tim Watts from Australia, also talking about Indo-Pacific competition, but I understand in a bit of a different world. It's less than 1 year, but the world has changed. It's a real pleasure to be partnering here with the Austrian Institute of European and Security Studies, and welcome to the President, Mr. Fasslabend. Welcome very much, Werner. And also to the director of the Institute, Michael Zinkanell. But why we are here tonight is actually because the Australian Embassy supports us in bringing the finest minds from down under to Vienna. And the Professor Rory Medcalf is our speaker tonight. Please give him a round of applause. As I said, we thought with the lecture last year in May, we've done our job discussing the Indo-Pacific and Australia, but it turns out that that was a wrong assumption, actually, and we are right in the middle of a sort of geostrategic competition or dynamics, as the title of tonight's lecture is. And this dynamics has various names. One of them is the name of Donald Trump. And Donald Trump is one of those who also fired on the discussion in Australia about defense spending and security. And I read just recently that this discussion is talking about 3%, maybe even more than 3% of GDP for military spending in Australia. At the moment, it's about 2%. So just to let you know, in Austria, we were well below this. We try to achieve the 2% objective. But this is part of a discussion, actually, which I would love the speaker to refer to, that there was a discussion about NATO membership of Australia on various occasions, years ago. And the response was actually, well, NATO has a different name. It's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. But this was maybe in a geostrategic dynamic field, this is not enough as a response. So the question is there any wish in Australian politics to join NATO? And if so, would NATO be ready to accept a country like Australia? And would it make sense for Australia to talk about NATO membership at all? What we know is, as part of this dynamics, Australia is looking for partners, and Australia has more regional allies than Austria can ever have, I would say, in all sorts of fields. And this is a fact, actually, of the geographic situation of Australia. And lately I heard, and maybe you want to say something about this, there is a theory that Australia has to make sure that all the islands around the big country have also to be defended, and possibly land grab is one of the dangers that is part of this dynamics that we are here. So you see, there are so many open questions for a country which seems to be so far away from Vienna, Austria, but the issues are unfortunately quite similar that we have in various countries. So I'm looking forward to tonight's lecture and welcome you again from our side, and I pass over to the President of AIES. Thank you.
Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, also heartily welcome from my side personally and in my function as President of the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy. As the name of the Institute is expressing, of course, we are concentrating on European politics, unification of Europe, and especially on security policy. But more or less, almost from the beginning, at least for a period of 10, 15 years, we also have a strong focus on the Indo-Pacific. Why? The reason is that the Indo-Pacific region at the beginning of the 21st century has become the new center of global gravity. In past periods, this had been the Northern Atlantic. Even before, in antiquity, it was the Mediterranean. And for the first time, the Europeans are confronted with the situation that they are not situated anymore in the center, the global center of gravity, but outside. But, of course, we are touched by all the developments that go on over there. Why has the Indo-Pacific, more or less it is a relatively new notion for this area, not having existed or not having been used for such a long time. Why has it become the center of gravity? We have to be aware that it is not only the rise of China, it is the demographic developments. There are two countries, China and India, that have round about double the population of the whole European continent, Russia included. One of them has 4 times the population of the United States of America. And of course, this has consequences. We are confronted not only with the rise of China, but with the high technological and economic standard of Japan, of Korea, of Taiwan, with the rising importance of Southeast Asia, and of course with an enormous dynamics of development in the Indian subcontinent. Not only India, but also Pakistan, Bangladesh. And this all together, of course, has changed the global situation quite a bit. In addition, we also have, of course, the rise of the Arab Peninsula. And insofar, the world has changed because this area has become not only enormously important for the global traffic. If you just look at the choke points, the Suez Canal, Red Sea, Bab el-Mandab, Strait of Hormuz, Strait of Malacca, South China Sea, Strait of Taiwan. And suddenly the Europeans are realizing that not only their markets are situated over there, but also that our lifeline, at least our second most important lifeline, goes into this direction. And there's quite some vulnerability. And therefore, we are interested also in the security question over there. And when we have today or tonight such a prominent professor who has so much experience in so many fields, I have to say, of course we are interested, we want to learn from him. What is going on in the Quad? What is going on in AUKUS? How is the real situation between the big ones and the not so big ones? What is the relationship between and the dynamics between the middle powers like Indonesia and others for this region? And insofar, I think we do have and will have the chance tonight to learn a lot. With this, I just want to welcome you, Professor, especially. It's a big, big pleasure to have you here. And now I hand over to Michael Zinkanell. He will moderate the session. He probably will say a few words about your career and the different relations where you have become a real specialist, and everybody is looking forward then to have your report, to have your statements, and afterwards, of course, we are interested and are looking forward to have a discussion with you. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, I would also like to welcome you tonight to this wonderful event, the Geostrategic Dynamics in the Indo-Pacific and Australian Perspective. My name is Michael Zinkanell. I'm the director of our institute, the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy. And judging simply by the fact that there's hardly any empty space here at the Vienna School of International Studies, it's a sign for me, a symbolic sign, that the topic that we have chosen tonight, the Indo-Pacific perspectives, dynamics in the Indo-Pacific area, and especially this expert insight from Australia, is also resonating here with us in Central Europe and Austria, which symbolizes to me the relevance of the topic that we have chosen tonight. It's my great honor and pleasure to welcome our main speaker, Professor Rory Medcalf, here with us tonight. Professor Medcalf, you're the head of the National Security College at the Australian National University since 2015. Over the last decades, you have expanded your experience and expertise in different fields, combining academia with diplomacy, with being an analyst in the intelligence field, but also a journalist. You're an expert for Australian-India relations, for Australian-Japan relations, and truly an expert for the entire region, and to some extent, therefore, also a mastermind behind the concept of the Indo-Pacific, this mental map that you have also explained in one of your most recent books. So it's my great honor and my pleasure to welcome you. Thank you very much for being here with us and for sharing your perspectives on the Indo-Pacific with us, and to also allow us to ask some questions during the Q&A session afterwards. Thank you very much.
You want to sit?
No, I'll stand. Oh, sorry, thank you very much.
Can turn those off.
Yeah. Well, thank you. That's. Can you hear me? Can you all hear me at the back? Thank you for that incredibly gracious and I think generous welcome. And I think I feel a little bit humbled by the expectations here. So I'll do my best to make it useful for all of you. Thanks for coming along this evening on a somewhat rainy evening here in Vienna. It's also fantastic to be back in Vienna. I haven't been here for quite some time, as I was explaining to my hosts, but it's really wonderful to be here, and I think understanding really the perspectives that this city, that this capital, that this country has on history and on geopolitics is very useful for me and for Australian colleagues as well. Look, thank you in particular to our hosts. So, Ambassador Brix, thank you so much, Dr. Fasslabend and Michael as well, and to my colleagues at the Australian Embassy who have managed to hijack me on a tour of a number of countries in Europe, and they've said repeatedly and persistently, you must come to Vienna. I'm delighted that I've done that. So the topic is quite a big one that I've set myself, and what I'll try to do in the next little while is give you an overview of how I think Australia sees the Indo-Pacific strategic environment. So we'll begin with what is this Indo-Pacific thing, which is quite a contested geographic idea. Then I'll talk really about the Australian perspective. What are Australia's interests in this two-ocean region? What are the priorities that Australia sets for itself for our security, prosperity, and really for the peace and stability of the region? What are some of the key relationships that Australia has fostered in the Indo-Pacific? I'm glad already that India, Japan, the quadrilateral dialogue have been mentioned, but there are a few other ones as well, and I may even get to the relationship with a country named the United States of America, which I think is interesting us all at the moment. I do want to touch a little bit on the Australia-Europe relationship, but of course over all of this is the question of Chinese power in the Indo-Pacific and what that means for us all. And so I'll try and conclude with a few thoughts on the global dimension, and then let's have a dynamic question and answer session. So let's begin with the Indo-Pacific. And you're right. I think, as our hosts have said, I think Dr. Fasslabend, you mentioned, that 10, 20 years ago, it would have been very unusual and confusing even to be talking about the Indo-Pacific in Europe. In fact, I think the first speech I gave on the Indo-Pacific in a European venue was in 2012, and I had a lot of my German hosts quite perplexed at that point. But of course now, just about every serious power in Europe is thinking about its Indo-Pacific strategy. What is it and what's happened? Many of you are familiar with the concept of the Asia-Pacific, and throughout the latter part of the 20th century, that's what we talked about. In fact, being here at a diplomatic academy, I can remember when I joined the Australian Foreign Service in the dim and distant 20th century, and I joined an Australian Foreign Service where we had a minister, Gareth Evans. Many of you will know of Gareth Evans, who had a very particular worldview and a very preferred map of what he called the East Asian Hemisphere. Basically, if you moved slightly off the coast of Western Australia, you fell off the map and disappeared because there was nothing there. So we had a vision of our region that excluded South Asia and excluded the Indian Ocean, but paid a huge amount of attention to Southeast Asia, North Asia, China, Southeast Asia, Japan, etc. So it was part of the story, but it wasn't reflecting the fact that the Australian continent, and you can look at a map and see where we are, is a two-ocean, even a three-ocean continent, and in a region that is defined by maritime connectivity. What I would contend, though, is that the Indo-Pacific is actually not new. And so, yes, I think mastermind is perhaps too generous, but yes, I was one of a number of analysts who over the last 20 years or so has done a lot of work to develop and popularise the concept of the Indo-Pacific. And I think that made sense because we could see a region where there was massive economic growth, there was massive growth in connectivity between the different parts of an Asia-centric maritime region. China was rising, but also India, also Southeast Asia, and so many other economies in the region. And we could see connectivity and contestation across that two-ocean region becoming the norm. But that was actually, I think, in many ways, a return to normality, because for the second half of the 20th century, we had this temporary interruption in what I think has been a broadly connected Indo-Pacific dynamic of our region for hundreds, even thousands of years. And that is, after the Second World War and in that era of, I guess, early post-colonial independence, India, China, Indonesia and elsewhere, many of these countries turned inwards. And so their trading relations with one another, their connections with one another, that actually had been the norm as pre-modern societies, pre-modern civilizations for hundreds or thousands of years, was ruptured. So we had a period of time there where the Indian Ocean did not seem to matter so much, where there was relatively little economic, commercial and strategic connectivity across the Indian Ocean. That all changed. And it changed, interestingly, with the rise of China. So the irony is that China is the country that is particularly critical of the concept and the term Indo-Pacific, perhaps because it has the word Indo in it, not Sino. And I mean that not entirely in jest. China has been uncomfortable with the concept of the Indo-Pacific, but the reality is that it was actually China's growth as a trading power, as an external-looking power in the 1980s and 90s that made the Indo-Pacific moment inevitable. In 1993, China became a net importer of oil from the Middle East and Africa. That was one of those turning points towards a return to an Indo-Pacific economic and strategic system. Likewise with the rise of India, likewise with the growth of trade between Europe and Asia. You think about those sea lanes, it's already been mentioned. I think it's an absolutely correct point of analysis that Europe is a stakeholder in the Indo-Pacific order because of the reliance on the sea lanes across the Indian Ocean through the South China Sea and to those big economies in our region. And so in the early 2000s, a number of Australian, but also Japanese, and also Indian and American analysts all began to, I think roughly in parallel, see these trends emerge and see that the strategic system that we were moving into, was an Indo-Pacific system. And of course, that suits Australia's geography. It matches Australia's geography. I'm not sure it's necessarily a good thing to be at or near the centre of gravity in global affairs, but it is a reality for us today and something that we're getting used to. So, we've returned to an Indo-Pacific system in the first half of the 21st century. Let's see how long it lasts, including if we see, for example, significant trade going through Arctic sea routes in years to come. But we're in this Indo-Pacific moment now. What does it mean? So critics of the Indo-Pacific say, well, this region is too big to be meaningful. Where are the outer boundaries? Is the coast of Africa part of the Indo-Pacific? Is the coast of Latin America part of the Indo-Pacific? It's half the UN General Assembly as one region. And that's a fair point, but I think we need to focus on what is the core and connective tissue of the Indo-Pacific, and that is, it's a maritime region. It's a region that is really defined by connectivity and contestation across that two-ocean system, and that in turn is defined by the interests and the engagement, particularly of the larger powers. So China, India, Japan, the United States, but also to some extent some of the larger trading countries from elsewhere, Southeast Asia, Europe, Australia. The core of the Indo-Pacific geographically is maritime Southeast Asia. So the South China Sea, highly contested, I know, but that is also the core of this region. And Australia may not be at the centre of the region, but our northern and western coasts are obviously a vantage point, a critical vantage point on the region, which makes our strategic geography especially important. So the region is maritime. The region is also multipolar. And so I know there's interesting and quite profound conversations to be had about what multipolarity means in today's world and how, for example, the United States is suddenly embracing its own version of multipolarity, whereas for a long time multipolarity was seen to be the preserve of the non-aligned countries, of China and others. But the Indo-Pacific is multipolar. Yes, China and the United States are the two most powerful countries in and engaged in the region, but India is a rising power with very serious interests and capabilities now and enormous potential for growth. Japan remains a very credible power, not only economically, but also as a strategic actor, also in its security capabilities, and Japan's strategic diplomacy has been very effective over the last 20 years in making the Indo-Pacific concept a reality. The major economies of the world are all invested in the Indo-Pacific in trade and investment. South Korea, another significant power in the region. Australia itself, a power militarily, economically, and so forth. Indonesia, the big growing power of Southeast Asia. And it's fascinating when you look at the Indo-Pacific balance of economic weight and you project forward another 10 or 20 years, we will start seeing effectively coalitions of countries in the Indo-Pacific that, without the United States in the room, will be larger than China in population, in economy, even potentially in military spending. So there are many players, engaged in the Indo-Pacific. It's a big mistake to think about this purely in terms of US-China rivalry. And Europe is engaged. Europe's interests economically, but also strategically, have a place in the Indo-Pacific. Whether we like it or not, Russia is an Indo-Pacific power and something that we have to come to terms with in our region as well. So all the players are there. So multipolarity, maritime, the global centre of gravity, I agree with that, economically, in demographics, but also in strategic weight. And so in that sense, what happens in the Indo-Pacific is actually everybody's business. I think one of the great misconceptions about the territorial differences in the South China Sea, for example, is that they are purely a problem between China and its neighbours. In fact, the South China Sea is, in every sense, at the heart of the Indo-Pacific. This is a region defined by connectivity and contestation. And I think going to the second part of that conversation, the challenge we have ahead in our region, even putting aside for a moment the question of the future of security in Europe and in the transatlantic theatre, but the challenge for Australia and our region is how to ensure that we can maintain stability, prosperity, order in our region without conflict, without major conflict with China, but without capitulation of our interests, values and identity to China as well. And there lies a profound problem. So for Australia, turning to the Australian focus as I threatened, what does this mean? Now, Australia is a country that is defined by a number of things. One of those is, whether we like it or not, an extraordinary mismatch between our interests and our capabilities. You just look at the map, you look at the size of Australia's territory, you also consider the size of the maritime zones around Australia, that our Navy, that our border forces, that our civilian maritime authorities, that our Air Force needs effectively to monitor and police. You think also about the rather audacious claim that Australia has to 1/3 or more of the Antarctic continent, the largest claim of any country in Antarctica. And you consider the fact that our interests relate very much to our lifelines to the world. I think that term lifelines has come up this evening, and I completely agree. This is an era where no island is an island. No country is an island, including countries like Australia that are an island continent. It's our lifelines with the world that are vital to our prosperity and security, flows of obviously trade, exports and imports, for us flows of energy and resources, flows of information, flows of people, regulated of course, but all of those lifelines are vital to our economy, our prosperity, our security, and they're overwhelmingly maritime in nature. So for example, Australia's studying very closely what's happening to undersea cables in the Baltic at the moment, because of course the same risk is there for us in the future. And because Australia's interests are so much larger than our capabilities, we have always placed a premium on partnerships. We need allies, we need friends. For most of the history of modern Australia, of course, that was the United Kingdom and the British Empire. After 1941, for obvious reasons, or 1942, that turned to the United States. And what we've tried to do in Australia is not only have a great and powerful friend and an alliance that serves our interests, and there's a really interesting conversation to be had right now about the future of that alliance, but we've also sought engagement with countries in our region. And so for me, I think one of the exciting parts of the Indo-Pacific journey for Australia in the past 20 years has been very dynamic engagement with a number of significant Asian powers where we did not have substantial relations before. The Australia-India relationship in the 25 years that I've been working on India has been transformed. It's not an alliance, it's not going to be an alliance, but it's a very comprehensive partnership at every level, including security, including our forces, training, exercising, working together at sea, enormous economic complementarities. People of Indian origin are the fastest growing community in Australia today and contribute enormously to our prosperity and our national future. Japan, I think the story of Australia-Japan reconciliation after the Second World War is a global model for how adversaries can be reconciled. And from a Japanese perspective, apart from the United States, there is no closer partner in the world than Australia. But also countries in Southeast Asia. This has been a real focus of Australian diplomacy, and I think the question is, how deep can we make these ties? They're not going to be a substitute for the alliance with the United States, but they can do very important cross-bracing, if you like, very important reinforcement of the alliance, and at a time when there are question marks about the future of the US alliance system globally, having this minilateralism, as we call it, small groups of partners in the Indo-Pacific, and the Quad with India, Japan and the United States is the most prominent of those, is a very effective way to encourage a US role in the region, but a role where the United States recognises that we are working together, we're pulling our weight as well. Let me turn to China, because the opportunity and the risk around the Indo-Pacific concept is overwhelmingly to do with China. The Australia-China story in this regard is, I think, quite illuminating for European observers. I was having some conversations elsewhere today about Australia-China relations, and I think the word that came up in some of those conversations was Australian pragmatism in dealing with China, but I think there are other dimensions of that as well. There is a very strong sense of anxiety in Australia about the meaning of Chinese power in our region, just as we have this mismatch between our interests and our capabilities, so too do we see the growth of Chinese power in our region, the way that has been assertively used, the connection between internal control by the Communist Party state in China and external assertiveness and coercion by China. We see all of that as a challenge to the stable Indo-Pacific order that suits Australia's interests. If there's time, we can have a conversation about even bigger things like the future of a rules-based order in the world, but I think that from an Australian perspective, as a middle power, 27 million people in a region where there's a lot of tension and where our most significant friends are a long way away, for Australia, international law and rules are deeply entwined with our interests. These are not simply matters of values or principles. It makes sense for a middle power to have a region where there's predictability in the behaviour of states and where might alone does not make right. With the rise of China in the Indo-Pacific, just as I said, economically from the 1980s and really the 1990s onwards, it was overwhelmingly a story of connectivity and opportunity, and there was really, as an extension of that, in the early 2000s, I think a large degree of naivety in my country about China. So too, over the past 10 years, has that story turned and has opportunity turned into risk. So of course there is still reasons for us to engage with China. It is our largest trading partner, not investment partner. But it's very clear now that there is an imperative by the Chinese leadership to be the dominant power in our region. Now, dominance may come naturally to great powers, but the nature of the Chinese political system and the way in which it challenges the multipolarity of our region, the way in which China is brushing up against the interests of many other countries and not just the United States, places a very special pressure on Australia to be a coalition builder and a convener to try to help maintain an order that serves our interests, and to try to keep the United States engaged in the Indo-Pacific in ways that suit our interests. Our government has a term, strategic equilibrium. As I interpret that, that means we want deterrence without destabilisation. It's a very, very difficult balancing act. But for Australia, looking to our immediate neighbourhood, and I would distinguish the neighbourhood as being the South Pacific, so I think this again was mentioned in the opening remarks, the small island countries of the South Pacific and those parts of maritime Southeast Asia that are closest to Australia. For Australia, we cannot afford to have a potentially hostile power. I'm not calling China hostile, but it's potentially hostile to our interests, have a military and security presence in that inner arc. The one time that Australia has been existentially threatened in a military sense was in the early 1940s when the Imperial Japanese military was effectively seeking to isolate Australia through dominating the island chain to Australia's east and Australia's north. And it's fascinating to see that in the last 10 years, the expansion of Chinese political influence, economic influence, development assistance, security presence, and full spectrum presence in the region has matched that geography. So it means that for the first time since the 1940s, Australia has to devote security attention to our eastern flank. The Pacific Ocean is not so Pacific anymore. And this was heightened in Australian threat perceptions recently, may or may not have made the news here in Vienna, when the Chinese Navy paid us a very special visit and sent a task group of 3 vessels to do not only a visit, an uninvited visit to the South Pacific, but actually a circumnavigation of the Australian continent. As one commentator said, the most consequential circumnavigation of Australia since the early 1800s, when the British explorer Matthew Flinders proved that Tasmania was an island by circumnavigating the continent. And that was, I think, a diplomatic misstep by China, because it's actually revived security anxieties in Australia at a time when our relationship with China was stabilising after a period of tension and economic coercion. And it's reinforced the arguments for stronger Australian defence capabilities, stronger Australian defence investment, and the AUKUS technology sharing arrangement with the United States and the United Kingdom, which would give Australia nuclear-powered submarines if it proves to be successful, and there are questions about that. So China does overshadow the future of the Indo-Pacific for Australia, and it's in our interest to keep as many friends and partners engaged in that region as possible. And I think when we look at a lot of the concern about the US posture towards Europe now, it's natural for us to think, how will this have repercussions in the Indo-Pacific? It is too early to catastrophise about the future of the US alliance system in the Indo-Pacific. There are very strong reasons why the United States will want to be present. The key question is, can the United States compete with China without being present in the Indo-Pacific? But having said that, it makes perfect sense for middle powers like Australia in the region to do some of the self-strengthening that we should have done quite some time ago. Look, I'll conclude by talking a little bit about the global implications of all of this and the way in which I see the Indo-Pacific strategic theatre connecting with the Euro-Atlantic, and then perhaps we can go to questions on issues like the Quad, AUKUS, Australia's relationship with NATO, etc. Look, there's a dissonance in what I'm going to say. So, you know, at one level, it is confusing for me to say that when it comes to balancing Chinese power in the Indo-Pacific, we need the widest possible coalition of partners. And that means that our friends and partners in balancing Chinese power in the Indo-Pacific, they're not all going to be liberal democracies. Those that are democracies are all not going to be the same kinds of democracies. You know, we're not looking for a narrow values alliance in this regard. So, for example, Vietnam is a serious partner for countries like Australia seeking to maintain equilibrium in the Indo-Pacific. Whereas globally, Australia has, I think, very deep interests in as rules-based an order as we can maintain. The sanctity of the UN Charter, which has been so affronted by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Australia has a position where we want to be as supportive of an outcome in Europe that does not reward aggression, because for us, the most dangerous signal to send is a signal to not only China, but others. North Korea is another example. In the Indo-Pacific, a signal that says aggression pays in the 21st century. So Australian diplomacy and statecraft is going to be constantly navigating that tension. It means that our relationship with India, for example, our relationship with Indonesia, will be one where we acknowledge where those countries stand on the European situation. We have different views. We're not, in my view, comfortable or pleased with the positions those countries have taken, but we understand where they're coming from. But at the same time, we will do everything we can to engage those countries to not contain China, but to balance Chinese power. So that's the the tension I want to introduce in thinking about the global connection. But there are two or three, probably three other factors that I'll leave you with that tell me that we cannot disconnect what happens in the Indo-Pacific from what happens in Europe. The first we've already touched on, that is the deep economic enmeshment. There are a number of obvious potential flashpoints in the Indo-Pacific. The most glaring of those is the very plausible prospect of China launching aggressive military action to annex Taiwan. That would have global repercussions economically that, in my view, would make the invasion of Ukraine look like a relatively minor interruption to global business. And I don't mean that lightly. It would be devastating for the economy in our region. It would be devastating for the economy that supports China's prosperity and the quality of living of the Chinese people and all the achievements of Chinese people and government over many years. So there's the economic interconnectedness of the Indo-Pacific and the world. There's also, interestingly, a set of relationships, particularly between China and Russia, but also North Korea and Russia, that have brought the Indo-Pacific into the European security situation. I don't know how many of us in this room anticipated that there would be North Korean combat troops in Europe in action in 2024, 2025. But here we are. The role of China in supporting Russia's war economy is another very clear sense that whereas some of us may debate the interlinkage of the Indo-Pacific and the Euro-Atlantic, these countries are already living it in a very grim strategic sense. And finally, there's the obvious question of American power. If the United States is indeed reappraising its relations with Europe under the second Trump administration, there are several explanations as to why that might be happening, but one, of course, is to do with the United States reinforcing its presence in the Indo-Pacific, reinforcing its competitive posture with China. I'm not saying that's the only answer. I think we don't have clarity on that yet. But whatever happens in a redistribution of the balance of American attention and power and willingness to take risk globally, it's going to tie intimately to that connection of the Indo-Pacific and the Euro-Atlantic. All of these are very good reasons for Australia and European nations to do more, to understand each other's security interests, to understand what we can do to improve our own strength and resilience in these uncertain times. And that means that Canberra and Vienna may be far apart, but I think it's very timely that we have this conversation. So I'll stop there, and I'll look forward to questions.
Excellent. Professor Medcalf, thank you very much for these inspirational remarks. It was certainly very enlightening for all of us to hear your expertise and your clear thoughts on the Indo-Pacific, on the developments, on the dynamics and the relevance that I also mentioned very briefly previously. I'll start with one or two questions from my side before we probably open for the general public present here, and starting probably with the central player that you mentioned, which is also China. And going back to your book that you wrote, 2020, The Contest for the Indo-Pacific, where you mentioned that we cannot actually, and by we I don't only mean now the Indo-Pacific powers, but I suppose that you meant that we as a global community cannot actually contain China, but we should go into a state of some sort of coexistence or competitive coexistence that you based on 5 different principles back then, on solidarity, on development, deterrence that you briefly mentioned, diplomacy and resilience. And my question would be, going now from 2020 to 2025, within these last 5 years, has that shifted, that notion that we have to go into some sort of a coexistence with China? And if so, these principles, especially the principle of deterrence, has that grown in importance?
Thank you. Great question. And it's very nice to know that somebody read my book, or at least seems to have picked up some of the key messages. And it's kind of high time that I revisited some of that. But I think the argument I was making there was precisely that it was a false binary to say either we accommodate China or we contain China. And so I actually used the term competitive coexistence, which, it's not an original term. It's been used, in fact, subsequently the same term was used in framing Biden administration policy towards China. And I think that term still remains valid. You want coexistence, you want peaceful coexistence, but you want it to be done in a recognition that there is a power competition going on, but preferably a competition that has limits, that is bounded. So I identified deterrence or defence, diplomacy, development, resilience and solidarity as the 5 principles of that coexistence. I think that holds true. I do think deterrence has become more important, and I guess where I would question my own analysis on that now is to say that with the invasion of Ukraine, with the increasingly forthright way in which China has, under Xi Jinping has confidently said, this is a changed period in history, we need to take advantage of that. Is China breaking the rules now? Is China doing more than competition? Is it going for some sort of all-out struggle? And that's where I think we have to be prepared to revisit our thinking at the moment. But I think at the moment, I would stick by my 5 principles.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You also mentioned the European Union, and being here at the heart of the European Union, of course, I'm like to challenge you on the point that you said the European Union is present in the Indo-Pacific. I mean, in terms of the interest of the European Union, in terms of the economic interest in the growth potential that the Indo-Pacific region has, for sure the European Union is present in that sense. But is it actually present in the realistic sense, the sense that, or probably I'll frame it a little bit different from the reality, how present the European Union indeed is, to a ideal scenario, how present it should be vis-a-vis the importance of the Indo-Pacific? Where do you position the EU here?
If I said European Union, I didn't mean European Union, I meant Europe.
Okay.
And when I say Europe, I include Britain in Europe, and I look primarily at European powers. So Britain and France in particular, no question, they are engaged in different ways in the Indo-Pacific, including in a military sense. In France, in a territorial sense, that may be controversial, but it's a geographic fact. And I think when you look at Europe more generally, the ability of Europe to provide an alternative to the United States and China in the development of a number of countries in our region, particularly Southeast Asia, and the South Pacific remains. Now, again, with the focus of Europe on its own confronting strategic situation with Russia, maybe that level of investment is going to decline. But I think, relatively speaking, Europe has a lot to offer. Some in this room would be surprised how much respect I think Europe has in Southeast Asia for its ability to provide that third way.
So you don't mean the EU as an institution, but more individual European countries and their interest or their economic, but also to some extent military presence in the region.
Yeah, look, I think I think Europe's interests are engaged. I think it's unrealistic to expect a substantial European military presence in the Indo-Pacific, and I think that while it's admirable that a number of European powers and the EU collectively has said we will have an Indo-Pacific strategy, it's a big mistake to then give the impression that, for example, in a future military crisis in the region, there's going to be a major European contribution on the ground or in the water. There are differences Europe can make, but I think that in other areas, as that development partner, as a partner in technology, in education, in capacity building. There are plenty of other things Europe can do. And in fact, of course, at the moment, with the questions we have about US aid, the future of US development assistance, Europe actually is becoming more important. Don't forget also that when I talk about the Indo-Pacific, I'm including the Indian Ocean. And so if you look at the Western Indian Ocean in particular, for many years there has been European naval and maritime contributions. When you look at the development of India as a major power in Europe, in the Indo-Pacific, India has recognised the potential, including in defence technology, of Europe as a partner that can help it reach its potential. So I think we need to get beyond a sense that somehow there needs to be, a fleet of ships with European flags coming over the horizon, although it's still good to see what does happen. I mean, we have had, the German Air Force visit Australia recently. Fantastic. It's just that it's not going to be the strategic game changer.
And
the military dimension.
And it also shouldn't be, if you would recommend it now to European stakeholders.
I don't think it can
leaders,
be.
Or can be.
So I think
it's not feasible.
Should or shouldn't doesn't enter the picture, in my view. Okay. Yeah. What can make a difference? So again, more than niche contributions, but very strategic contributions. So for example, if there's a future crisis across the Taiwan Strait, if we end up in a period of protracted confrontation with China, and let's hope that never happens, but if it does, who are the players that are going to secure the Indian Ocean? What difference would, a British nuclear-powered submarine, a French nuclear-powered submarine, the Indian Navy, capabilities like that make to effectively backfilling the security of the Indian Ocean, while hypothetically the United States concentrated on the Pacific. I think there are interesting prospects like that, but I think in mass, no one wants or expects Europe to be a major player in the Indo-Pacific in a military sense.
Yeah. You mentioned another country which is hardly ever mentioned when talking about the Indo-Pacific, Russia.
Yeah.
How do you assess Russia's role in the region?
Okay, so this is an Australian perspective, and it's may or may not be close to the Australian government's perspective, but it's an independent Australian perspective. Look, for many years we have seen Russia in the Indo-Pacific as a spoiler. So in other words, Russia cannot be, a full spectrum strategic power in the Indo-Pacific. China plays that role, and the Russia-China relationship is an important sort of augmenter of Chinese power in the Indo-Pacific. But Russia can make life difficult for Japan, for the United States, for US partners and allies. And Russia can also do some interesting things that may be in Russia's interests, but are certainly not ideal for the stability of the region. It's interesting, however, that this is not all pro-China activity. And so when we try to formulate a view of the future of the Russia-China relationship, it's worth looking at how they work together in the Indo-Pacific. Yes, their navies will do some exercises together. Yes, there'll be some coordination of their harassment of the Japanese, for example. Don't forget, there are contested maritime boundaries, contested territorial boundaries. At the same time, Russia provides Indonesia, India, Vietnam with weaponry that could play a very significant role if those countries found themselves confronting China. It's complicated.
Do you think that, therefore, and probably also due to the shift towards probably a stronger spoiler role of Russia, there also has to be some sort of turns?
Look, I think, again, I certainly can't get inside the head of the Russian leadership, but I'm sure there's a Russian aspiration to be a truly Pacific power. I mean, I think in the Cold War, Russia was a Pacific power and an Indian Ocean power as well. But for the foreseeable future, I don't think there's going to be the capacity to do it. The Russia-North Korea relationship, I think, is another area where that spoiler role comes into play, because anything that increases North Korea's military capabilities bad for South Korea, bad for Japan, bad for regional stability.
You also mentioned, of course, the lifelines that we heard already in the introduction. In addition to the most well-known lifelines, the Taiwan Strait, the South China Sea, the straits within the South China Sea, which lifelines do you see most crucial or most vulnerable in the foreseeable future?
So I use that shorthand to mean two things, really. Firstly, obviously we have very clear sea lanes of communication in the Indo-Pacific. Now, of course, these are not, as anybody who's been to sea knows, they're not clear lines in the water that say this is a sea line. But you can usually tell when you go to the Malacca Strait that there's this enormous amount of shipping that's following the most convenient, affordable route. The Malacca Strait is decisive, but the other straits through the Indonesian archipelago are important. The Sunda Strait, for example. So there are three Sunda, Lombok and Makassar straits through the Indonesian archipelago that are alternatives to the Malacca Strait in a crisis. But I didn't just mean the actual sea lanes themselves. I also meant the connectivity across the ocean. So if you look at a map of Australia, there's actually a very small number of undersea cables that basically connect us to the world. I think it's very disturbing news that this week the Chinese government has effectively announced two things. Firstly, that it does not cut undersea cables, but secondly, that it has developed and patented the most powerful undersea cable cutting technology. That doesn't compute. So, I think that we have a very clear signal about the risks that there would be for countries that rely on undersea cables for their communications infrastructure in a crisis. In the case of Australia as well, although we have significant natural resources, including energy, most of the refining of our fuels happens in other countries. So we import refined fuels. So it's not just the specific sea lanes, it's also the aggregation of dependence on those external lifelines that matters to us, matters to Southeast Asia, matters to Taiwan, matters to Japan, matters to South Korea. And a lot of that goes across the Indian Ocean. So interesting sort of data point as to why the Indian Ocean matters so much here. China, Japan and South Korea all rely heavily on that ocean for their energy, for their prosperity. And therefore, a conflict that put those sea lanes at risk would actually be devastating for all of the economies.
And probably the last question from my side, if we would meet again in 5 years from now, against the background also of the potential of the middle powers in the region, where would you like to see those middle powers to be situated in 5 years now?
5 years. 5 years is not a long time.
No, it's not.
Yeah.
I'm thinking
you're
rather
showing your
short
youth.
time.
Yeah. Look, I think we won't get very far in 5 years. We've come a long way in the past 20 years. And so I'll probably think a little bit more intergenerationally, if you don't mind. Look, I think that we face a phase of intense risk globally. I mean, it's an intense phase of risk in the next at least 5 years globally. In the Indo-Pacific, I would have said before the current US administration that our period of greatest risk is probably, I'd say, the next sort of 3 to 5 years. And that's partly because of the growth of Chinese military capability, the growth of Chinese confidence in using that capability, and the period of time that it's going to take for the United States and its allies to bring their own capabilities online. I mean, for Australia, for example, the AUKUS submarine deal with the US and Britain, I think has a good strategic logic to it, but the timelines are too long, really, to affect the next few years. But beyond the next few years, I think we need to take a deep breath and think about opportunity as well as risk. So, we talked about coexistence with China. I still have a vision for our region's future where we can find that coexistence, where the Chinese leadership can recognise that the best interests materially of its people are not served by a posture of confrontation, including the threat to invade Taiwan. And where perhaps after some crises and near-war risks, there's a realisation across the region that we need to refocus on diplomacy, statecraft, confidence building, etc. And if we get through that window, if by the 2030s we haven't had a strategic breakdown in the region, then I think the tide begins to turn. For example, the balance of power, there's an assumption that time is on China's side, and China spends billions of dollars to reinforce that message in its propaganda and public messaging. But if you take an intergenerational point of view, time is actually not on China's side. You know, if you look at the 2040s, if you look at the growth of India, the growth of Indonesia, the growth of other economies and populations in Southeast Asia, it's going to get more difficult for China to dominate the region, not less. And so that idea of equilibrium, with or without a frontline role for the United States, becomes more realistic into the 2030s and the 2040s. The problem is we may not get there without a strategic breakdown in our region or here. One way we will get there, though, is through that middle power coalition building that I've spoken about, and using that to encourage the role from the US that we want to see.
Excellent. I'd like to open the floor for questions from the audience. And first question here in the second row. We'll collect maybe 2 or 3 questions and then go to the answers. Please, if you could shortly introduce yourself and ask a brief question, that would be lovely.
Yes, of course. Thank you very much. Samuel Schubert from Webster University. Professor Medcalf, you've talked about the strategic breakdown. You've talked about security. You started with this, wondering whether everybody here has heard about the circumvention, right? Which was, I think everybody has heard, right? And it came just, on the heels of the arrangement between the Canadians and the Australians and over the horizon radar, where clearly Australia would have picked this up, would have seen them coming. Maybe they lost them along the way, but took no military action whatsoever to deter it.
Yeah.
So in all the things that you've just described, the only peaceful outcome rests on a hope that it will not collapse, right? That our worst, I won't say fears, our most probable assessments, to be frank, are that there is an opportunity for China to use military force as soon as possible within the region and to execute that within the next 3 to 4 years. And before we can get all the facilities out into the region to deter it in some fashion. So this balancing, this regional multipolarity, historically, balancing at that level doesn't necessarily lead to peace. It leads to a spiral to conflict. So what is Australia doing to calculate the conflict, the fact that its population rests along the coasts, that it is ready to fire? This is not about ships and the ability to compete, but more on a question of, say, modern technologies, EMPs, various forms of drone technologies or other things that can take away that advantage and raise the cost of any military action, be that immediate to the area and the other. And how does this fit in, and that's just the last part, with what appears to be a Caribbean strategy for the Chinese, very similar to Mahan's strategy in the Caribbean when the U.S. pushed the European powers out and ultimately was able to control the entire region and establish the sea lanes of communications in the Atlantic. So, thank you.
Thank you.
There's a lot there, and I'll respond. Let's take 2 more.
Let's take another question,
You can help me
please.
keep track of them,
Yes.
Good evening, Maria Malcznik from the Austrian Institute. I have a political question. As Australia is facing general elections in May and there's a possible change of government, how consensual, how politically consensual are foreign policy and security policy issues in Australia? Because we recently witnessed how electoral outcomes fundamentally changed the foreign policy attitude of countries, or in the Austrian case, almost changed the foreign policy attitude, and it would be interesting to know that.
Thank you. And one more question here in the third row for this round of questions. We'll have a second round.
Thank you.
As well.
I'm a diplomat with the European Union mission to the United Nations, but soon I'll be the number 2 in Canberra, the European Union mission to Australia. So I'd be very much interested in hearing cooperation between the EU and Australia. And you've already mentioned that probably like in terms of military boots or ships on the ground, that you don't expect too much. But there's also, of course, military industry cooperation. And here, now we are starting to rethink, is it really such a good idea to buy F-35 and not maybe Eurofighter Typhoons? The Australian Army has swapped Leopard tanks for Abrams, and you have the AUKUS cooperation, which you didn't really address too much. And so you swapped French submarines for Americans, and probably also looking at buying F-35s. So I'm wondering, is the same thinking or questioning starting in Australia? And is there room maybe in the future for more cooperation between the EU and Australia in that field? Thank you.
Thank you very much. 3 extremely relevant questions for the first round.
Those 3,
yes, please.
And I'll work backwards, actually. So, yeah, that's welcome to Canberra. See you soon. Look, I think there is at the moment a reasonably strong appetite in Australia for more engagement with Europe, more engagement with the EU, but also more engagement with individual European powers and partners. I think this will be a slightly controversial statement, but it proves that I'm not representing the government view. Europe has not traditionally had a natural political constituency in Australia, and that's actually that's been part of the challenge. So, the right in Australia has tended to look to the United States and the United Kingdom. The left in Australia has this sort of mythology about engagement with Asia. Even though, interestingly, if you go back to the late 19th century, it was the Labor Party in Australia that was the strongest advocate of a racist immigration policy. So, it's an interesting, which was very much anti-Asia. So it's an interesting tension. But the mythology of the centre-left in Australia over the last 50 years has been they're the party of good relations with Indonesia in particular and Southeast Asia. And so Europe's fallen between the cracks a little bit. In fact, the best Australian leaders that engage Europe are usually, centrist, technocratic people. I mean, actually, Malcolm Turnbull, the former Prime Minister who did the original French submarine deal, was one of the more pro-European Australian leaders we've had. But I think there is a sea change going on in Australia. There is a recognition across the political spectrum that Europe is facing this terrible moment of strategic truth and strategic decision, that Europe does have either actual or latent capability and resilience, that there are things we can learn from Europe. Interestingly, I've just published a paper on how Australia can learn from the resilience of Finland and some of the Nordic states, the way that they take that approach to national security, because some of the challenges are not so different. Whether it's dealing with cable cutting or your dependence on sea lanes of communication, and how do you secure a large territory with a small population. So I think it's actually quite a fruitful time. There was even, interestingly, going to our political debate, a mention by our opposition leader in a speech last week that he will try to reinvigorate the plans for a free trade agreement with the EU. And I think, I'm sure the EU delegation in Canberra is taking a little bit of heart from that. So this will extend to looking at Europe as we seek to diversify our economic security, as we seek to diversify suppliers of not just defence technology, but other security technologies. And yes, that does rub up against a dependence on the United States. We already have F-35s. You know, they've already become the mainstay of our Air Force. AUKUS is a bet not only on American submarine technology and American cooperation, but also the British. So, you know, there is a very clear tension there. I mean, the ideal Australian defence policy would be one that has a plan A and a plan B at the same time, but that would be inordinately expensive. So you'll find yourself there, I think, at a pretty, lively time in the security debate. On the question of Australian politics and bipartisanship or cross-partisanship, so for those of you who follow some of this, you know, we've traditionally had a two-party system. The two-party system is breaking down. So we've had a centre-left Labor Party, a centre-right coalition of parties. Our Liberal Party is, you know, effectively a Conservative party. But we now have third forces. We have a Greens Party that has tended to be a very ideological Greens Party, although interestingly last week for the first time they started talking about having a defence policy. So that's an interesting development in the new era. We have lots of independents and others, some of them very sensible, some of them not. So whoever forms government in Australia after the next election will probably be in minority and will have to do deals on legislation with these other forces. Foreign and security policy, I think, will largely be quarantined from that because there is a broad consensus between the two major parties still to stick with, I think, some very established foreign and security policy directions, including the US alliance. But that said, I think there is now a lot of scrutiny of the US situation, the Canada-Europe situation, and I think what we'll see is a very overtly interests-based approach to the alliance, as opposed to the sometimes slightly sentimental approach that our politicians have spoken of. I think it is too soon to say that because of the confronting situation for Europe and Canada, that somehow the United States is going to walk away from its allies in the Indo-Pacific. But we do have to be constantly watchful now in ways that we probably wouldn't have been about 5 or 10 years ago. Please come and work for our Defence Department. I really liked your intervention. I think, look, realistically, I don't think there's going to be a radical shift in our defence policy towards, a very short-range set of self-reliant capabilities that are simply aimed at making the Australian continent a kind of a fortress at short range. And I think that makes sense because of the lifelines issue. I mean, we could we could at great expense make it much more difficult for an adversary to approach within a few hundred kilometres of the Australian continent. They can just blockade us in that case. So, you're basically just creating a great castle for a siege without supply lines. I think we're going to have to continue to have a much more layered set of defence and security policies. The only thing I can say with certainty about that is it's going to get much more expensive. And we have gotten away with spending less than 2% of GDP on defence for many years. We're now hovering around 2%. And we have ambitions to move to about 2.4, eventually 2.7 over many years. That's not going to be enough, especially if we stick with AUKUS, because while I think there is a strategic logic to AUKUS, which is submarines, nuclear-powered submarines that match our geography. If you look at Australia's geography, I know that sort of naval power is probably not something that is, sort of daily conversation in Vienna these days, but if you look at our geography, conventional submarines are not very useful. It's a bit like having a police car that has just enough fuel to get onto the highway before you have to go back to the station to refuel. To get from our submarine base in southern Australia to the north is, a large volume of diesel fuel. So watch this space. I think I'm glad you made the point about the Australian radar, the gently over the horizon radar, which we are selling to Canada, which is a very good capability. I think it's fair to assume that Australia's maritime domain awareness capabilities did track this Chinese flotilla pretty much continuously, and we did see them coming. Where I would be mildly critical of the way we approached it is that the Australian public found out about the Chinese flotilla from the Financial Times, which interviewed somebody at the Pentagon who told them the story, and it got into the FT and we all read about it. Once it became public, yes, the Australian Defence Department eventually started putting out daily reports saying this is where they are, this is what they're doing. I think it was right that we weren't confrontational about it, because even though we don't like what they did, it was legal under international law. It was the live fire exercise was outside not only of our territorial waters but our EEZ. I think it's been, though, very bracing for the Australian public. It's made the Australian public, I think, much more concerned about maritime security, and I think that's actually a good thing.
Mm-hmm. If I may, can I just very briefly ask a follow-up question combining the second and the third question?
Yeah.
If there is a change in government, do you see that might also affect the Australian-EU relations?
So, we currently have a Labor government. Came to power 3 years ago. We have had some very good foreign and security policy outcomes under this government, but some very disappointing ones too. I guess it's the case with every government. What's been good is that we stabilised relations with China, but at the same time, we've competed very effectively with China for influence in the South Pacific. We've proven that you can do those two things at once. I've been a little disappointed about the relations with Europe, because I think that it took a little while for the government to appreciate the importance and value of Europe as a strategic actor, but I think that's changed. So I think we're at a point now where both the major parties in Australia want to do more with Europe, and it's actually refreshing to hear the Conservatives say that, because Peter Dutton, the Conservative leader, has traditionally been he's one of the fathers of AUKUS. He's been a very pro-US, pro-UK leader, but I think he's beginning finally to get that Europe should be a partner. So I think, to be honest, whoever wins the Australian election, Australia-Europe relations will strengthen.
Okay. I think there's one more question here in the front row and then the back. Yeah. Please.
Yeah. So my name is Sunil Gupta. I am from Australia, and I work for an international organization. So the rise of China, we have seen it from 80s, 90s, and now.
Yeah.
And Australia per se, we've enjoyed some really excellent trade relations with them. Is it that the trade relations or our trade policy somehow had overshadowed our defense policy, and we have come to a breaking point or a point of no negotiation, that now, after nearly 30 years, we are now taking those steps that could have been perhaps proactively taken earlier? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's a gentleman in the back. And then the one gentleman further back.
Thank you.
I can take a few more if you want.
Okay.
Yeah.
My name is Mustafa Kibaroğlu. I'm a Turkish diplomat for 3 weeks only, but I used to be an academic for 3 decades and teaching courses on arms control, disarmament, non-proliferation, as well as strategy. And I used to teach strategic decision making and touching on this subject as well until last month. My question is, what kind of tangible assurances Australia can give or provide to the rest of the world that nuclear submarines will never carry ballistic missiles tipped with nuclear weapons? That's the question I know. Because of my background, I have to ask that. And my second point, if I may remark, would it be too naive to think as to whether China might be trying to keep its lanes of communication with the rest of the world, especially for import and export, considering its more than 1.5 billion population and trying to balance the development levels between East, Southeast, and the rest of the country? Because, you say balancing, but they say containment. So because of this difference of perception, so far, if you look at the statements made from the highest echelons, down to the lower levels of diplomatic services. I mean, the sense of urgency does not seem to be there in terms of an imminent aggression that China might display in the coming years or so. So thank you.
Thank you.
So much there. Yeah.
And the gentleman.
Okay.
Yes, please.
Yes, Rick Bosch, Oslo World Affairs Forum. American, former military, spent some time in the Navy in the Pacific. With circling back to the circumnavigation of Australia, while symbolic, militarily probably insignificant, the U.S. has a battle fleet, aircraft carriers, nuclear attack submarines in the region 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. U.S.'s largest military base, South Korea, largest overseas military base. Bases or military presence in Okinawa, Taiwan, Guam, Australia, Japan, or back in the Philippines. Who's pushing who is the first question. And the second question is probably the biggest U.S. military threat, if you call it a threat, is that the U.S. is really reaching a point that economically can't sustain this level of foreign deployment, even in this region, even though it's a focus and critical. I just wanted to hear your comments on that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Then we take one more question, please, to my very right. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Lisa. I'm an international relations student from Central European University.
Yeah.
And first of all, thank you so much for opening this conversation to the public, particularly to the young audience that we have with us today. My question is, from your perspective, what is the state of Chinese diplomacy? It's clear that the hide and bite strategy is already long forgotten.
Yeah.
Does it look like it is assertive or confrontational? Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, please, Professor.
You can help me navigate those. I'm going to work backwards again. I'll start with Chinese diplomacy, go to US military presence, and let's see where we end up. Look, I think I can only speak to the Australian experience of this to some degree. It's very hard to sort of simplify and summarise what the state of Chinese diplomacy is. I mean, the quality of the diplomacy has vastly improved over the last few decades, no question. And I think the thing that often confuses me in dealing with Chinese diplomats is that they still get so much wrong. You know, so in a sense, I'll use the example of the China-Australia relationship and the period of economic coercion that we went through, the period of confrontation we went through with China from 2020 to 2022, precipitated by the Australian government being a little bit maybe too brave and reckless in being the first government in the world to say, let's find out where this coronavirus came from. Mm-hmm. You know, there should be an international investigation into the origins of COVID. Now, I think Europe was essentially saying the same thing, but Australians were saying it a bit more loudly, a bit more rudely. And I think at that point, our relationship with China had been deteriorating for a long time for a number of reasons, including Australian, I think, credible accusations of Chinese political interference and espionage and things like that in Australia. And therefore, China was actually looking for a trigger to punish Australia, and this moment became that trigger. So we went through 2 years of quite extreme wolf warrior diplomacy. So it certainly wasn't hide and bite, it was full wolf warrior. I think a low point of that was literally Chinese state media producing caricatures of Australian soldiers killing children in Afghanistan. So, I mean, because Australia at the time did have a war crimes investigation, which we had initiated against some of our own troops. And so that effectively alienated the Australian population. So a lot of the Australian business community who had been very pro-China because of the economic opportunities, a lot of mainstream Australians were alienated by really clumsy anti-diplomacy by China. when the economic coercion began to end in 2022, China recognised that it wasn't working, and they wanted a face-saving way, an excuse to end the coercion. They used the change of government in Australia as that excuse. You know, we had an election, new government, gentler rhetoric, and so China backed off. And the quality of the diplomacy improved again. Having said that, though, I'm still surprised at how ineffective China is at seizing some of the opportunities for influence in Australia, influence in Southeast Asia. Yes, China's increased its influence in the region, but it still seems to be able to, you know, alienate us through this maritime visit, alienate the Japanese, alienate the Philippines, alienate Vietnam, alienate India in particular. I think the disrespect to India has been a major strategic blunder by China. And so I'm left with this confusion, in a sense. I think that China has some very good, very skilled, very thoughtful diplomats, but they still seem to need to speak to a domestic audience, which is not a good way to do diplomacy. Going to the United States military presence around the Indo-Pacific, I think, look, I acknowledge a lot of your observations, but I think you yourself identify the tension there that I think is beginning to drive a lot of Australian concern. That is, yes, the United States has very substantial military presence around our region, but yes, there is the question of, is this sustainable? And if it is not sustainable, then we need to get ready for a future where the US will still be our ally, we'll still be able to engage them sometimes, but not always in the way we want, when we want. So we have to do more for ourselves. And I think, I'm not going to get into a sort of the debate on who's pushing who in the US-China relationship, other than to say that a lot of the issues that I think have created strategic anxiety in the Indo-Pacific haven't been simply US-China relations. China-Japan, China-India, China-Vietnam, China-Philippines, China-Taiwan, China-Australia, those are not only US-China. And I think the view that if the United States would only get out of Asia, that somehow we would have a region of peace and love, I think is unrealistic, and I think it doesn't respect the national interests and identity of a large part of the population of Asia that is much larger than China. And finally, I think the interesting, and I know of course that there's great mistrust of the United States by China, but the interesting data point there is that no country has done more to help build the economy of modern China than the United States. So in that sense, no country has helped China become the great power that it is more than the US. Japan helped a little bit. So I think it is disappointing that they haven't been able to reach the kind of cooperative coexistence that should have flowed from that. And I think the counterfactual for me is what would have happened if early this century China had continued on a political reform path rather than a hardening of the control of the Communist Party. I think we might have had quite a different world, and hopefully less need for all of that military capability. There were two other questions.
Which brings us probably to defense policy versus trade policy.
Oh yeah, and there was one other? Or?
And there was the one on assurances of the nuclear power.
Yeah, I'll go to the nuclear thing first, if that's all right. Yeah, I think the question about safeguards and assurances from Australia possessing nuclear-powered submarines, and therefore somehow that being a slippery slope to Australia being a nuclear weapon state. Look, I can understand the messaging about that. I mean, it's the kind of message that we've heard, particularly from China in the early days of AUKUS about 4 years ago. Firstly, in terms of the proliferation risk from AUKUS, the Australian government, I know that colleagues in the room in this city has, constantly engaged with the IAEA to build a regime of assurances that if and when Australia receives nuclear-powered submarines, that effectively, the reactors will be, contained black boxes effectively that Australian crews won't be sort of opening up and somehow depriving ourselves of transport fuel by turning it into nuclear weapons. But the more serious answer to that question from my point of view is that Australia is an enormously long way from being seriously considered as a contender for nuclear proliferation. In the 1960s, we did talk about it. In fact, the Americans came to us and shouted at us and said, "You sound like the French," because we had a Prime Minister who wanted to keep open the option of nuclear weapons. That debate is dead in Australia. And even now, with all the rising security anxieties in the world, the desire for increased defence spending in Australia, the stuff that you're hearing out of Poland, Germany, Japan, South Korea, countries that are saying, well, we need to think about our future options. You're not hearing any of that from Australia. Okay, the last point was about
defence policy versus trade.
Yeah, and so look, it's a nice kind of dichotomy, but I would break it down a bit differently. I would say that what's happened in the last few years is that we've finally begun to realise that economics and security are a continuum. They're not, they're not two completely opposite things. And did having a good trade relationship with China in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, did that mean we spent less on defence because we felt we didn't need it? Look, I think it was an even bigger confusion than that. I think unfortunately, the illusion that we were labouring under in Australia in the 90s and early 2000s, it was similar to what I guess many in Europe were assuming, which is that globalisation and all of the benefits of a connected global economy, borders breaking down, the nation state becoming less important, all of that made interstate military confrontation less likely. It made the need for defence forces less likely. So I think it was much of a, the Australia-China trade relationship was just part of a much, much bigger story of misplaced optimism and complacency. And that's why it is interesting for us now to be studying some of the Nordic countries where they actually never stopped thinking in a comprehensive way about national security. The other point, and I'll close on this, about Australia and China, and I do want to see a relationship of mutual respect and mutual economic benefit, but I would emphasise that trade is not about trust. So investment is about trust. And the Australia-China trade relationship is still doing okay after sanctions on things like barley. By the way, the quality of beer in China went down for a couple of years quite badly because they stopped importing Australian barley. I think it's up again, thankfully. Barley, lobster, wine, some other coal, some other exports. But the critical lever of iron ore, Australia's biggest export to China is iron ore. They didn't pull that lever because it would have been very self-harming. So we went through the trade sanctions and now all of that trade is back and some of it's bigger than before. But certainly our business sector has been warned, they've been burnt. They know that they should make profits while they can, but they also need to diversify. What has changed much more profoundly is the investment relationship. And so 10 years ago, China was on track to become one of our largest investment partners. That stopped. It stalled. China now hovers low on our list of foreign investors because of the national security safeguards that were introduced to screen foreign investments. And so I think what's happening now is that we're beginning to get a kind of total economic security mindset. We're a long way from putting it fully into practice, but I think increasingly Australians are thinking about defence and economics in a sort of similar sphere, and I think that's a good thing.
Excellent. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for participating in this discussion. Dear Professor Medcalf, thank you very much for your very elaborate and comprehensive presentation. It was extremely insightful that you presented the importance, the dynamics of the Indo-Pacific, but also Australia's perspective on foreign security policy here in landlocked Austria. I think maybe we can also establish this sort of intellectual lifeline, and I hope that we can have a further conversation in the future. Special thanks also to, of course, the Australian Embassy here in Vienna that also facilitated this discussion, and to all of you for participating in the very fruitful discussion and Q&A session. Thank you very much. We from the AIES will certainly continue to work on exactly these topics, as they certainly will be even more important and timely in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, excellent.